government, military, economic, and diplomatic attacks. Today, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about Iran's reaction. We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Welcome to The Real Story on the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. If you enjoy the show, please show your support for this independent programming by going to patreon.com/The Socialist Program and subscribing. We can do this show with you, but not without you. We are joined today by Professor Mohammad Marandi. Mohammad is an expert on American studies and post-colonial literature. He teaches at the University of Tehran. Mohammad, welcome back.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Mohammad, I'm looking at a New York Times article from last week. Of course, this article comes after the Vienna talks where the U.S. and Iran were having what was described as indirect discussions. Iran would not meet directly with the United States on the issue of the U.S. re-entry into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear arms deal as it's known here in the Western media. Here's the headline of the article. I want to read the headline in a couple sentences, and then I want to get your reaction. Here it is. Iran rattled as Israel repeatedly strikes key targets. Subtitle: Recent attacks suggest that Israel has a clandestine network inside Iran and that Iranian security services have been powerless to break it. Here's the first sentences. In less than 9 months, an assassin on a motorbike fatally shot an al-Qaeda commander given refuge in Tehran. Iran's chief nuclear scientist was machine-gunned on a country road, and 2 separate mysterious explosions rocked a key Iranian nuclear facility in the desert, striking the heart of the country's efforts to enrich uranium. The steady drumbeat of attacks, which intelligence officials said were carried out by Israel, highlighted the seeming ease with which Israeli intelligence was able to reach deep inside Iran's borders and repeatedly strike its most heavily guarded targets, often with the help of turncoat Iranians. Now, the article goes on, Mohammed, to talk about 2 decades of sabotage and assassinations by Israel and with the support or directed by the United States. But the point of the article, the theme of the article, is that Iran is suffering from embarrassing security lapses. There's not really any discussion either of a technical, literary, or emotive character that describes these acts as terrorism, as a violation of Iranian sovereignty, as unprovoked acts of war. None of that. It's all about Iran's apparent weakness in the face of these attacks. So if the shoe was on the other foot, for instance, if the article was about Iranian assassinations or sabotage or covert operations inside of Israel, it would have all been about the immorality and the devilish character of the Iranian government. That's not the theme. But anyway, I want to get your thoughts about the timing of this article, the theme of the article, and what is, in fact, actually happening inside Iran, and how Iranians, in particular, perceive these endless attacks by the U.S. and by Israel.
Yes, well, I think the first thing that I should point out is that these attacks against Iran and Iranians are not being carried out by one regime. It's not the Israeli regime versus the Iranian people or the Iranian government. It is a host of Western countries that have been giving the regime intelligence through different means, and it's also the fact that, unfortunately, Western embassies in Iran, some Western embassies at least, there's even a history of IAEA officials that have passed on intelligence to Western intelligence agencies that have then passed them on to the Israeli regime. And that's how the Iranians believe that the 4 scientists that were murdered about a decade ago, that's how they were murdered, and that the IAEA was involved, or people within the IAEA were involved in passing on intelligence to Western intelligence agencies that led to the Israelis carrying out these attacks. And the Israeli regime uses MEK terrorists. These MEK terrorists, it's an organization that fought alongside Saddam Hussein against Iran during the 1980s, and then they began working for the Americans, and they're based in Albania. There are thousands of them there. So the Israelis use them to carry out the attacks, these American-funded terrorists. And also, the Iranian intelligence believes that during previous attacks, the Israeli regime used American military bases that are around Iran, that surround Iran, as well as diplomatic centers belonging to the United States for logistical purposes. So when we look at all that together, I think actually the Iranians have done a pretty good job in protecting themselves. When you look at it, the sheer number of governments that have been helping the Israeli regime against Iran. And the interesting thing is, of course, the fact that the New York Times seems to be gloating. And instead of, as you rightly point out, instead of pointing out that the Israeli regime is carrying out illegal murders and acts of terror, that they seem to be gloating that the Israeli regime can carry out such attacks, which of course is an exaggeration. I mean, the Iranians are definitely not rattled. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of the narrative on Iran in the West. On the one hand, Iran is rattled, Iran is weak, Iran is paranoid, but on the other hand, Iran is a rising threat, and Iran is a danger to the region, if not the world. And that's a very strange paradox that the Western media and Western governments like to promote, and that includes the New York Times. But obviously, the Iranians have shown themselves to be quite capable of defending themselves. The Israelis have been hitting Iranian ships, and now Israeli ships are being hit in response. And the Israeli regime, while they repeatedly carry out airstrikes in Syria, and they claim that they're targeting Iranians, but they've failed to give the name of a single Iranian over the last few years, the last 3-4 years, that has been killed in any of these airstrikes. The reason is because the Israelis don't kill Iranians, they kill Syrian soldiers that are fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But the Western media likes to mimic what the Israeli regime is saying because they support the apartheid regime. This whole wokeness that we see in the United States has nothing to do with anything that goes beyond U.S. borders. When it comes to Iran, this hierarchy of humanity and civilization is very much in place.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And, you know, the New York Times is considered within the broader range of the American media, American corporate-owned, capitalist-owned media, to be one of the liberal papers, say, compared to, say, Fox News outlets or some of the others. And it's so important for people to recognize how they really are, what they really stand for, the truly deeply imperialist character of this media. And I think it's so important about wokeness because you'll read through, if you go through the New York Times, you'll see all kinds of articles about sensitivity to this or that real issue that exists for people. The New York Times has a sort of a fine-tuned sensitivity in that area. But here I'm looking at the New York Times from shortly after the 1953 coup led by the CIA, by Kermit Roosevelt, in concert with British intelligence, after Britain and the United States imposed sanctions on Iran back then against the Mossadegh government when it dared to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as BP, for the crime of having nationalized Iran's oil to help Iranians overcome poverty and the legacy of foreign domination. The government was targeted for overthrow, and it was demonized. If you look at the language used by the American media and the government against that government, the government that was there between 50 and 53, a democratically elected government, a so-called secular government, same demonizing, colorful language. Here's what the New York Times wrote after the coup. and after the American-British counter-revolution that put the Shah, the dictator, on the throne in Iran, New York Times wrote, quote, "Underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism." Again, this is after Iran nationalized its oil company. The term fanatical nationalism, now, Mossadegh was not a religious leader. He wasn't part of the Islamic Republic in Iran. But the same language, the same demonizing, caricaturing language of fanaticism employed. And here you have the CIA, the very liberal CIA, saying, you all of you in the third world, in the developing world, you have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid. And when we're talking, Mohammed, about the heavy cost, I think most Americans don't know what the New York Times is talking about, but it's not simply the toppling of the leadership. I mean, there was a heavy price that was paid by the Iranian people then and for decades afterwards.
Absolutely. I think this is very revealing that it really doesn't matter whether it's the Islamic Republic of Iran or whether it's Nicaragua or whether it's Cuba or whether it's Venezuela or Syria. What is important is that the United States wants complete domination, and so do its allies. And any country, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or Brazil, if these countries want to have an independent foreign policy, if they want to have control over their internal economic policies, the United States will find that unacceptable. If Iran, if the Islamic Republic of Iran's leaders were obedient to the United States, do you think that any of these narratives against Iran being extremist and radical and irrational and dangerous and backward, do you think any of these would exist? Definitely not. But in truth, what we've been seeing over the last 4 decades is how Iran has been misrepresented willfully, how Iran has been demonized willfully, simply because the Iranian people have decided to make their own decisions inside the country, to have their decisions made in Tehran rather than in Washington, to have their own indigenous values involved in constructing their